Solution is at plexidermtrial.com or call the number on your screen.
Good evening. I'm Alicia Menendez. President Trump's federal officers are walking the streets of Portland tonight. Will other cities be next? And what legal grounds are being used by this administration to shoot protesters with tear gas? That's where we start tonight. Using troops to calm civil unrest is, according to one historian, as American as apple pie. It's happened for decades, even centuries. Federal forces were brought in for the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and when Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. And more recently during the Rodney King riots in 1992. But what's unprecedented is President Trump's plans to use federal forces for a series of other reasons, including fighting violent crime.
We have more federal law enforcement, that I can tell you. In Portland, they've done a fantastic job. They've been there 3 days, and they really have done a fantastic job. I'm going to do something, that I can tell you, because we're not going to let New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, Detroit, and Baltimore, and all of these, Oakland is a mess.
This bloodshed must end. This bloodshed will end. Today I'm announcing a surge of federal law enforcement into American communities plagued by violent crime.
We want to go in and help the cities. We want to help Chicago. We want to help all of them. If they invited us in, we'd go in with 50,000, 75,000 people.
Trump says they're doing a fantastic job, but the Justice Department's Inspector General launched a probe this week into the use of force of Trump's officers, including an incident where one protester was shot in the head with a crowd control weapon and left in critical condition. Unidentified forces detaining people in unmarked vans, and repeated use of tear gas, including this week on Portland's mayor.
I'm not going to lie. It stings. It's hard to breathe. And I can tell you with 100% honesty, I saw nothing that provoked this response. It's nasty stuff. I'm not afraid, but I am pissed off.
The IG's probe is just one of a list of growing legal issues for the president's deployment of these forces in U.S. cities, including a suit from Oregon's attorney general and calls for a congressional investigation. And Portland officials sent a cease and desist letter just this week. The president retreated to his New Jersey golf club for the weekend as he tries to shift the focus to protests and crime amid a week of retreat. The Washington Post points out Trump backed down on many of his long-held positions as his poll numbers fall. Republican support wanes and coronavirus cases explode. He reversed course on demands for a payroll tax cut, kids back in schools, and his plans for a packed arena for the Republican National Convention in Florida. A lot to unpack here. Joining me now, Jason Johnson, professor of politics and journalism at Morgan State University and MSNBC political contributor, Maya Wiley, a university professor at the New School and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Conrad Wilson, a reporter for Oregon Public Broadcasting. Maya, a lot to unpack here. Let's go really big picture. When you watch the images of what is happening in Portland, what does that tell you about where we are in this moment as a country?
Now, in this moment as a country, we're watching a president essentially directing troops, agents, federal agents who are not sufficiently trained or prepared to do what they're doing and who are inciting violence. And from some of the videos I've seen, potentially violating constitutional rights of protesters, First Amendment rights and rights against search and seizure. Look, remember that what we're talking about here is a president who is distracting the public from some very serious issues he has not sufficiently attended to, like coronavirus, and essentially saying, oh, look, I need to send in and take control of cities that, by the way, have their own police departments in a constitutional system in which it who are responsible for local crime, if there is any. He's using as an excuse the protection of a federal building, and there is a lawful right to protect federal property, but they're doing much more than that. And as we've heard the president say, what he's really saying is, I'm going to be the chief of police, I'm going to be the mayor, I'm going to be the governor, and I'm going to be the president. So I get to tell everyone what to do, and it doesn't really matter what the Constitution says. I'm here for me, not the Constitution. We should not be distracted from what our rights are as a citizenry. He has not been welcomed by the local government.
Jason Asmai says so much of this about distraction. That analysis comports with reporting we're seeing from the Washington Post that says this has nothing to do with violent crime and everything to do with Trump's reelection. Diversion is Mr. Trump's game. He hopes that frightening his white base by warning them of anarchy in democratic cities with large minority populations improves his prospects in the midst of a spiraling pandemic. Jason, I want to know both what you make of that analysis, but also what you make of this very dated notion of who lives and votes in suburbia.
Right. First off, Alicia, you got to point out that a lot of the groups that are protesting, Rose City Justice and Youth Liberation Front, the people on the ground in Oregon, it's white people. Oregon's a pretty white city. So the president is really just sort of demonizing urban areas with a sort of throwback stereotype about what these communities are actually composed of. And I'll be honest, I don't think, Alicia, I don't think that this is a political strategy. And the reason I don't think it's a political strategy on one level is because Donald Trump doesn't care about democracy. This is simply an occupation of an American city. And if he can use these same forces to put down legal protests, he will use these same tactics to stop people from voting in November. We have to stop pretending that this president cares about things in terms of politics or partisanship or anything else like that. This is nothing more than an occupation of an American city by the president of the United States. And if people don't see it that way, then all they have to do is look at the video from that city. There are local issues going on in Portland. I think it's complicated as an outsider that the mayor of the city is also the commissioner of the police, that there's a lot of things that could be handled there. But ultimately, the president doesn't care about what's happening in Portland or Kansas City or Chicago. He simply wants to occupy areas so that he can squelch democracy and ensure that he is able to stay in power, whether he's elected or not, in November.
Conrad, here's acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf. Take a listen.
What we are doing in Portland is a very specific mission. We are protecting that federal courthouse and other federal property. What we know is that these violent criminals, as you indicated, they operate somewhere between midnight and 5 a.m. every morning. And their number one goal is to destroy that building and set it on fire. That's their public stated goal.
Conrad, you have the president, you have the acting secretary of DHS calling these people violent criminals. Who are these people who are actually protesting?
I mean, we have a lot of people we're seeing out there that really are angry at racism in the criminal justice system. They're angry about police violence. And Portland has a very long history with a lot of tension between the city's black community and policing, issues in how the police deal with those in a mental health crisis. There's a long list of things that, have brought people out to protest. These protests were getting a lot smaller. Like everywhere, Portland saw massive protests after George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis. They were getting smaller and smaller. They never really stopped. But it's federal law enforcement that has really inflamed tensions here again. There was the incident you referenced where Donathan Lavella was hit in the head with a rubber bullet. There was the incident involving vans where, members of DHS were basically making these very suspicious-looking arrests that were, there were a couple of viral videos that went out. We broke a story about it. And, it's those actions that actually people are also showing up and saying, hey, we're really angry with federal law enforcement and what they're doing here. And you're starting to see I think, a return to sort of what brought people out in the first place, in that, that people, there are more and more Black Lives Matter protesters showing up saying, hey, the message is basically shifting on the ground to something that maybe got this all going in the first place.
Maya, you have Jason ringing just a terrifying alarm about what we're watching in Portland could mean for November's elections. I wonder, Maya, both if you agree with Jason's analysis and what systems of checks and balances are in place to make sure that that does not happen.
Well, I think I agree with Jason that Donald Trump cares about no one but Donald Trump, and he certainly doesn't care about the Constitution, and he will lie, cheat, and steal to win in November, if that's what it takes. I think the question here is, you know, we're going to see a lot of this voting happening by mail. So while the occupying, I don't know how the occupying force necessarily plays out in that, especially as a lot of people are going to want to use that option. I think one of the things that voting experts are very concerned about is it's going to take time to count the ballots. This is not going to be our typical presidential election. So what we have to do is make sure we're educating the public about that, because part of what Donald Trump is doing is manipulating the story, the narrative here around voter fraud, that mail-in voting is somehow rife with fraud, which is untrue. The research shows that that is simply false. And secondly, I think if it's a close race, he's going to use it to try to suggest that he's actually the winner when he's not, or he's going to contest. And what and how he does that to stay in power is, you know, something that people are preparing for with demonstrations. They're also preparing for legally. But remember that one of the things that we have is a constitutional order. And the Constitution says that at noon on January 20th, he's done. He loses access to the nuclear codes. And I think that what we have to do is protect our institutions. We should be thankful that we have a military that at least thus far has said, you won't call us into domestic cities for domestic crime. That's not our job. It would take the military supporting what essentially would be a coup if he tries to stay in the White House beyond January 20th. But we should absolutely not take it for granted. I agree with Jason. It requires preparation. It requires a commitment, and it requires a willingness to demonstrate, despite the fact that Donald Trump is trying to make the American public afraid to do just that.
All right, Jason, Maya, and Conrad, thank you. Coming up, the president